The night the propane ran out across 12 counties, freezing every trailer park and prefab home from Elkton to the South Dakota line, one structure stood unaffected. A low mound of earth and prairie grass on the edge of town. Smoke rising steady from a hidden chimney. Warmth trapped inside walls built the way homesteaders had built them a century before. And inside, the woman everyone had called backward for 6 straight months sat beside a glowing fire, listening to her neighbors' trucks circling desperately in the dark, searching for the heat they had mocked her for creating. 6 months earlier, on a bright April morning that smelled like thawing earth and new grass, Judith Carver stood in front of the county planning office holding a hand-drawn blueprint that made the clerk behind the desk go completely silent. "You want to build a what?" the woman asked, adjusting her glasses. "A sodhouse," Judith said. "Walls cut from prairie turf. Timber frame roof. Stone foundation." The clerk stared. "Like, from the 1800s? "Exactly like that. Ma'am, we have building codes now." Judith tapped the blueprint. "I've researched every code. Sod qualifies as masonry. The structure will meet load requirements. I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking for a permit." The clerk exchanged glances with another worker across the room. Someone laughed quietly near the filing cabinets. But Judith didn't flinch. At 51, she had already buried a husband, survived bankruptcy, and spent 3 winters in a drafty rental that taught her exactly how fragile modern comfort could be. She had inherited 40 acres of flat grassland outside Elkton, Kansas, land nobody wanted because it had no water access, no structures, no utilities. Just wind and soil and endless sky. Most people would have sold it. Judith moved onto it with a camper trailer, a shovel, and a plan nobody else understood. Within 2 weeks, word spread across Elkton. Judith Carver was digging up her own land in neat rectangular strips, stacking blocks of earth and grass roots like bricks, building a house out of dirt. At the diner downtown, the reactions ranged from confusion to outright ridicule. "She's building it dirt hot," someone said, shaking their head over coffee. "Like a damn pioneer," another added. "What's next, a covered wagon?" Even the local pastor mentioned it during a church social, gently suggesting that Judith might benefit from guidance and community support during what he assumed was some kind of breakdown. But Judith wasn't breaking down. She was building up. Every morning before dawn, she walked the prairie with a spade, cutting sod in uniform strips 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 6 inches thick. The roots held the soil together like natural rebar, dense, heavy, nearly indestructible. She hauled each block on a wooden drag sled, stacking them in overlapping rows along a stone foundation she had laid by hand. The work was brutal. Her shoulders ached. Her hands blistered and bled. But slowly, the walls rose. She left narrow gaps for windows and a door, framing them with reclaimed timber. She built the roof using salvaged beams and layered it with tar paper, then more sod, creating a living roof that blended into the prairie itself. She dug a shallow trench around the perimeter for drainage and lined the interior walls with lime plaster to seal against moisture. And all the while, people drove past her property just to stare. "She's insane," one woman said at the grocery store. "It's gonna collapse the first time it rains," a man replied confidently. But it didn't collapse. It hardened. The sod dried and compressed into walls nearly 3 feet thick, dense enough to stop wind, hold temperature, and absorb sound. The structure sat low against the land, almost invisible from a distance, its grassed roof swaying gently in the breeze. By late summer, Judith had moved inside. The interior was small, just one main room with a sleeping alcove and a cooking area, but it felt solid in a way no modern house ever had. The thick walls kept the space cool during the oddest heat. The earthen floor, packed hard and covered with woven rugs, stayed stable and dry. A cast iron stove vented through a stone chimney. Oil lamps hung from timber beams. She installed no electricity, no gas lines, no reliance on systems beyond her control. And when autumn arrived and temperatures began to drop, Judith stockpiled firewood, sealed the gaps around her door with wool strips, and prepared for winter the way her great-grandmother might have, with care, with discipline, with absolute self-reliance. Meanwhile, across Elkton, life continued as it always had. Families trusted their furnaces, their propane deliveries, their electric heaters. Nobody worried. Nobody prepared. Not until the first cold snap hit in early November and the propane supplier, serving 12 counties from a single depot, announced delays due to supply chain issues. Still, people assumed it was temporary. Then the delays stretched into weeks. Prices spiked. Rationing began. Some families started supplementing with electric space heaters, overloading a grid that was already aging and fragile. And on a brittle, windless night in late November, when temperatures plunged to 6 degrees and demand surged across the region, the system finally broke. The power failed at 9 p.m., rolling outages spreading across the county in waves as substations tripped one after another. Within 2 hours, nearly every home in Elkton sat dark and cold, the temperature inside dropping steadily as thin walls and cheap insulation surrendered to the night. Families huddled under blankets, burning candles, waiting for the power to return. But the grid stayed down, overloaded, fragile, unable to recover. And out on the prairie, inside her Sodhouse, Judith Carver didn't notice the outage at all. She sat beside her wood stove, mending a wool blanket by lamplight, the fire radiating steady warmth into walls that absorbed and held it. The temperature inside the Sodhouse hovered near 68 degrees, regulated naturally by the thermal mass of 3-foot-thick earth walls that refused to release the day's stored heat. No furnace, no propane, no electricity, just fire, stone, and sod doing what they had done for centuries. By the second night, desperation began to spread through Elkton. Hardware stores sold out of space heaters and generators within hours. Families with fireplaces burned through their wood supplies. Others packed into their cars and ran the engines for heat, idling in driveways until fuel tanks emptied. The warming shelter at the community center opened, but it quickly became overcrowded, running on a single backup generator that struggled under the load. And that was when people started remembering the woman on the prairie, the one they had mocked, the one living in a house made of dirt. The first visitor arrived on the third morning, a young mother named Angela Prairie, holding her 2-year-old son bundled in every blanket she owned. She knocked hesitantly on Judith's rough wooden door, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Judith opened it, and warmth spilled out like a living thing. Angela's eyes went wide. How is it warm in here?" Judith stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the Sodhouse felt like another world. The air was still, comfortable, almost cozy. The stove glowed softly. Light from the oil lamps flickered across plastered walls. A pot of soup simmered on the stovetop. Angela stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. "You don't have power." "Don't need it," Judith said simply. "Walls hold the heat. Stove keeps it steady." Angela sank onto a bench near the fire, her son curling into her lap. For the first time in 2 days, she stopped shivering. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what people said. For laughing." Judith poured her a cup of hot tea. "You're here now? That's what matters." By evening, 2 more families had arrived. A retired couple whose trailer had dropped below freezing overnight, and a single father whose propane tank had run dry 3 days earlier. Judith let them all in without hesitation, organizing sleeping spaces, rationing her food supplies, keeping the fire steady. The Sodhouse, built for 1, now sheltered 7. And still, the cold deepened. On the 4th night, temperatures dropped below 0. The power remained out. Propane delivery stalled completely as trucks couldn't navigate icy roads. The warming shelter downtown began turning people away. Too many bodies, not enough heat, the generator sputtering on its last reserves of diesel. That was when the county coordinator, a man named Phil Drennan, made the call to Judith's property himself. He stood outside the Sodhouse, staring at the low earthen structure that seemed to blend into the frozen prairie, smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. He knocked. Judith answered, her face calm, unsurprised. "We need help," Phil said bluntly. "The shelter downtown is failing. We've got families with nowhere to go." Judith studied him. This was the same man who had called her project a liability 6 months earlier, who had warned her that dirt walls wouldn't pass inspection, wouldn't hold up, wouldn't work. "How many?" she asked. 12 more. Maybe 15. Judith looked past him at the frozen land, then back at the warm interior of her home. She did the math in her head space. Firewood, food stores, water. "Bring them," she said. Phil blinked. "You're serious?" "I built this to survive," Judith said quietly. "That includes more than just me." By midnight, the Sodhouse was crowded but functional. Families slept in shifts on bedrolls and blankets. Children huddled near the stove. Judith organized rotations, fire tending, meal prep, water collection from melted snow. She enforced quiet rules, rationed supplies, kept order. And despite the cramped conditions, despite the cold raging outside, everyone inside stayed warm. Because the Sodhouse didn't fight the environment. It absorbed it, controlled it, transformed it into something manageable. One man, a mechanic named Kurt who had openly mocked Judith's project at the diner months before, sat near the fire staring at the thick earthen walls in disbelief. "I don't get it," he muttered. "How does dirt do this?" Judith crouched beside the stove, adding another log. Thermal mass. Soil absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. These walls have been soaking up warmth since summer. They'll hold it all winter. Kurt shook his head. "We all thought you were crazy." "I know. You could have told us. Explained it." Judith looked at him steadily. "Would you have listened?" Kurt opened his mouth, then closed it. Because they both knew the answer. The power stayed out for 11 days. The longest outage in county history. And during those 11 days, the Sodhouse on the Prairie became the only place in Elkton where people could sleep without fear of freezing. Judith ran the shelter with quiet efficiency. She taught families how to conserve firewood, how to melt snow for water, how to cook over cast iron. She showed children how pioneers had lived, not as a history lesson, but as immediate, necessary survival. And slowly, the ridicule that had followed her for months transformed into something else entirely: respect. By the time the power finally returned and propane deliveries resumed, the story of Judith Carver and her Sodhouse had spread across 3 counties. News crews arrived, filming the low earthen structure that had sheltered 23 people through the coldest disaster in decades. But Judith refused interviews. She simply helped families gather their belongings, sent them home with instructions for insulating their own houses better, and returned to her quiet routine. A week later, Phil Drennan returned to her property, not with cameras, but with a proposal. "The county wants to fund a community emergency shelter," he said, standing in her doorway. "Built your way. Sodhouse design. Thermal mass. Off-grid heating." Judith raised an eyebrow. "You told me this wouldn't work." Phil nodded slowly. "I was wrong. We all were." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. We'll talk." Over the next 6 months, Judith consulted on the county's first modern Sodhouse, a structure twice the size of her own, designed to shelter 50 people during emergencies. She taught local builders how to cut sod, how to layer it, how to engineer the walls for load-bearing strength. And across Elkton, something shifted. Families began reinforcing their homes with better insulation. Some built root cellars. Others installed with stoves as backups. The hardware store started stocking earth-building supplies. Because the winter had taught them what Judith already knew: systems fail. Infrastructure breaks. And when it does, survival belongs to those who prepared. By the following spring, Judith's Sodhouse no longer looked strange against the prairie. It looked like what it had always been: a structure built to endure, designed with humility and respect for the land, created by someone who understood that modern convenience was a gift, not a guarantee. One warm April evening, Angela Pryor returned to the Sodhouse with her son, now 3 years old. She carried a basket of fresh bread and a hand-stitched quilt. "I wanted to say thank you," Angela said. "Really thank you." Judith accepted the gifts with a small smile. "You already did." "No, I mean." Angela paused, searching for words. "You saved us. And you didn't have to." Judith looked out across the prairie, where new grass was just beginning to green. "That's the thing about building something strong," she said quietly. "It's not just for you. It's for whoever needs it when everything else falls apart." Angela nodded, her son playing at her feet. "People are talking about you differently now. I noticed. Does it feel good? Being right?" Judith considered the question, then shook her head. "It feels necessary. There's a difference." That night, after Angela left, Judith sat outside her Sodhouse watching the stars emerge over the endless Kansas sky. Smoke drifted peacefully from her chimney. The prairie wind whispered through the grass. And somewhere in the distance, the lights of Elkton glowed steady and bright, powered by a grid that had been repaired, reinforced, made stronger. But Judith knew the truth that winter had written into the frozen ground. Strength wasn't about never failing. It was about building something that could survive when everything else did. She stood, brushed the dust from her jeans, and stepped back inside her sodhouse. The fire crackled softly. The thick earthen walls radiated warmth. And outside, the prairie held its ground beneath the stars, patient, enduring, waiting for whatever came next.